Back of my mind, I have a very definite limitation on commitment. And I don't think the Chiefs do, but I know that. Not a damn human thinks that 50,000 or 100,000 or 150,000 are going to end that war. We're not getting out, but we're trying to hold what we got. And we're doing we're losing at the rate we're going.
It was announced today that total American casualties in Vietnam now number 4,877, including 748 killed.
Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, on each of his 7 inspection trips to Vietnam, has found some positive aspect to the course of the war there.
The most vivid impression I'm bringing back is that we've stopped losing the war. The North Vietnamese today, we believe, have 9 regiments of
Some of the men had little training in a state park in Kentucky before coming here, but it did not prepare them for the thicket of trees, spiked vines, thorn bushes, almost perpendicular cliffs, 90-degree temperature, insects.
This has changed from a nasty little war to a nasty middle-sized war. The Vietnamese are still doing most of the fighting and most of the dying, but week after week, American casualty figures.
Now, America wins the wars that she undertakes. Make no mistake about it. And we have declared war on tyranny and aggression. If this little nation goes down the drain and can't maintain her independence, ask yourself what's going to happen to all the other little nations.
I am more and more convinced that we ought to think of some action other than military action as the only program here. But I think if we do that by itself, it's suicide. I think pushing out 300,000, 400,000 Americans out there without being able to guarantee what it will lead to is a terrible risk and a terrible problem.
Let me go back one moment. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, at the end, I think we did put ourselves in the skin of the Soviets. In the case of Vietnam, we didn't know them well enough to empathize. And there was total misunderstanding as a result. They believed that we had simply replaced the French as a colonial power, and we were seeking to subject South and North Vietnam to our colonial interests, which was absolutely absurd. And we saw Vietnam as an element of the Cold War, not what they saw it as, a civil war. There aren't many examples in which you bring 2 former enemies together at the highest levels and discuss what might have been. I formed the hypothesis that each of us could have achieved our objectives without the terrible loss of life. And I wanted to test that by going to Vietnam. The former foreign minister of Vietnam, a wonderful man named Tua, said, "You're totally wrong. We were fighting for our independence. You were fighting to enslave us." We almost came to blows. That was noon on the first day. Do you mean to say it was not a tragedy for you when you lost 3,400,000 Vietnamese killed, which on our population base is the equivalent of 27 million Americans? What did you accomplish? You didn't get any more than we were willing to give you at the beginning of the war. You could have had the whole damn thing. Independence, unification. Mr. McNamara, you must never have read a history book. If you'd had, you'd know we weren't pawns of the Chinese or the Russians. McNamara, didn't you know that? Don't you understand that we have been fighting the Chinese for 1,000 years? We were fighting for our independence, and we would fight to the last man, and we were determined to do so. And no amount of bombing, no amount of U.S. pressure would ever have stopped us. What makes us omniscient? Have we a record of omniscience? We are the strongest nation in the world today. I do not believe we should ever apply that economic, political, or military power unilaterally. If we had followed that rule in Vietnam, we wouldn't have been there. None of our allies supported us. Not Japan, not Germany, not Britain, or France. If we can't persuade nations with comparable values of the merit of our cause, we'd better re-examine our reasoning.
Americans suffered their heaviest casualties of the war in Vietnam last week, 543 killed in action. Another 1,247 were wounded and hospitalized. The deaths raised the U.S. toll in the war so far to 18,239. South Vietnamese put their losses for the week at 522 killed. Communist losses were not reported. Contributing to those record casualties has been the steady communist bombardment of the Marine outpost at Khe Sanh. There, the North Vietnamese have been tightening their ring around the 2 square mile position. The military expects a full-scale assault.
To what extent did you feel that you were the author of stuff or that you were an instrument of things outside of your control?
Well, I don't think I felt either. I just felt that I was serving at the request of a president who'd been elected by the American people, and it was my responsibility to try to help him to carry out the office as he believed was in the interest of our people. What is morally appropriate in a wartime environment? Let me give you an illustration. While I was secretary, we used what's called Agent Orange in Vietnam, a chemical that strips leaves off of trees. After the war, it is claimed that that was a toxic chemical, and it killed many individuals, soldiers and civilians exposed to it. Were those who issued the approval to use Agent Orange criminals? Were they committing a crime against humanity? Let's look at the law. Now, what kind of a law do we have that says these chemicals are acceptable for use in war and these chemicals are not? We don't have clear definitions of that kind. I never in the world would have authorized an illegal action. I'm not really sure I authorized Agent Orange. I don't remember it, but it certainly occurred, the use of it occurred while I was secretary. Norman Morris'in was a Quaker. He was opposed to war, the violence of war, the killing. He came to the Pentagon, doused himself with gasoline, burned himself to death below my office. He held a child in his arms, his daughter. Passers-by shouted, "Save the child." He threw the child out of his arms, and the child lived and is alive today. His wife issued a very moving statement. Human beings must stop killing other human beings. And that's a belief that I shared. I shared it then, and I believe it even more strongly today. How much evil must we do in order to do good? We have certain ideals, certain responsibilities. Recognize that at times you will have to engage in evil, but minimize it. I remember reading that General Sherman, in the Civil War, the mayor of Atlanta pleaded with him to save the city. And Sherman essentially said to the mayor, just before he torched it and burned it down, "War is cruel. War is cruelty." That was the way LeMay felt. He was trying to save the country. He was trying to save our nation. And in the process, he was prepared to do whatever killing was necessary. It's a very, very difficult position for sensitive human beings to be in. Morris'in was one of those. I think I was. $50,000 people came to Washington to demonstrate against the war. About 20,000 of them marched on the Pentagon. The Pentagon is a very, very difficult building to defend. We placed troops carrying rifles around it. U.S. Marshals in front of the soldiers. But I told the president not a rifle would be loaded without my personal permission, and I wasn't going to grant it.
What effect did all of this dissent have on your thinking? I mean, Norman Morris'in is 65, this is 67.
Well, it was a very tense period. Very tense period for my family, which I don't want to discuss.
How is your thinking changing during this period?
I don't think my thinking was changing. We were in the Cold War. And this was a Cold War activity.